Greetings, this is dslyecxi. In today's episode of Visualize Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures, we're going to look at LZ considerations as seen from the perspective of an infantry player who isn't very familiar with helicopters. We'll be going over selecting LZs from the map, what makes a good LZ, how to handle pickup zones and extractions, communication between ground and air, and more. If you haven't read TTP-3's Combined Arms Helicopter sections, they cover the broader picture of heliborne operations and air assaults. In this, we're going to do a deep dive into the LZ itself. Let's consider the situation of a player in a leadership position being asked to select LZs for where they want to be inserted during a mission. Ultimately, the pilots will be able to refine and adjust as needed, but with good considerations, the player will be able to give the pilots something that's workable. When looking at the map, there are a few different things you'll want to pay attention to when trying to locate suitable LZs. For the sake of this discussion, we're going to assume that any terrain we're on has 100-meter grid squares on the map. This is only ever not the case when a terrain is misconfigured, and that's pretty rare. Here we have a 100-meter grid square represented in 3D. Here's the same thing, but with the foliage being indicated by dots the same as on the 2D map. You're primarily looking for clear, reasonably level ground. An entire grid square being clear and level is a ton of room. And as we'll go into later, you can land plenty of aircraft in a significantly smaller area. The slope of terrain plays a significant factor as well. You can see this through the contour interval on the map. You want these lines to be spaced apart, as the closer they are, the steeper the terrain. Remember that the map shows different things depending on zoom level. When you zoom in, you'll see trees and forests indicated like so. If you zoom in a little more, you'll see bushes and smaller trees as well. Some areas that don't have trees will have brush or bushes, so looking at them on the map will initially give you a misleading view until you zoom in to see the bushes appear. Some objects may not show up on the map, and sometimes you'll get apparent forest coverage that actually isn't dense. For instance, in this area, the clearing in the upper part of the grid doesn't even show on the map. Due to these aspects, don't assume that because it looks one way on the map, it'll be the same once you get there. This makes forests and areas with heavy brush harder to plan from the map. Often it requires flying into the area to actually locate a suitable site. Here I've marked out a few seemingly usable LZs with yellow icons and have put red dotted borders around what the map shows as clearings. Now in the actual terrain, you can see how the clearings that the map showed are actually significantly different in size from how they appeared. Two of the clearings that look like appropriate LZs actually aren't, while two of the clearings that look too small are actually one very large clearing that could fit a few aircraft. If the LZ needs to be in such an area, giving a broad indication is usually sufficient. In that case, asking to be dropped a given direction and distance from an objective allows the pilots to find something suitable once in the area. We want to be able to look at the map and determine the suitability of an area to act as an LZ for three types of helicopters. Heavy, like Chinooks and Super Stallions, medium, like Blackhawks and Hueys, and small, like Little Birds. This visualizer shows a 100-meter grid broken down into sub-elements. The black border represents the full 100-meter grid. The blue border is a 50-meter square, or 1/4 of the size of the full grid. Green indicates a square that's 25 meters on a side, or 1/16 of the square. Red is 12.5 meters on a side, or 1/32 of a grid. Let's watch a few demonstrations of how big different helos are relative to a grid square. Here's Little Birds. For them, the green square, the 25-meter one, is pretty spacious. You can land a few together or even pack in 4 like you see here. The red square, which is roughly 12 meters on a side, is tighter and requires precision, but it's something a typical pilot can manage. Next we have Blackhawks, representative of medium helicopters. The blue square, which is 50 meters on the side, is pretty spacious, and several Blackhawks can land in that size area together, or up to 4 if you pack them like this. The green square is tighter, but still doable for a single helo. Red is off the table unless you like landing on fire and without rotors. And here come Chinooks, representing heavy helicopters. The green square is just a bit too small to be a tight fit, but the blue one is nice and roomy. A quarter grid LZ can handle 2 Chinooks at a time so long as the pilots are precise. So to recap, minimum sizes are red for small aircraft, green for most medium, and blue for heavy. If you can find a grid square that has a 1/4 section that looks clear and level, you can use that for almost anything. Remember that the more an aircraft has to approach an LZ vertically, the more room it needs for safety. A little bird descending through a 12.5 meter diameter hole in a jungle takes a good amount of concentration, but if you can find one that's 25 meters on a side like the green box, you'll see them able to handle it much more easily. Now that you have an idea of what sorts of sizes are required for different types of helicopters, and understand that verticality requires more room for comfort, let's look at the various other elements that factor into LZ selection. Terrain slope becomes a significant factor in hilly or mountainous terrain, but it can also become a factor when ditches, ravines, and other microterrain exist in an area. Here are a few different visualizations of what different contour density on the map looks like in the actual terrain. In this visualization, the white dots represent a 100-meter grid contouring to the terrain. The black frame above it represents level, and the numbers show how far below the highest point each of the corners is. To start with, we have open, flat terrain such as farm fields and similar. These may have undulations or slight slope, but it's usually nothing significant. While minor obstacles like hay bales might exist, there's so much room to land and they're so visible that they hardly matter. Next up are hills. These can vary in steepness and usable terrain, and saddles between hills are often viable when the slope is too great otherwise. This is a typical Cherner Russian hill. It's suitable for landing on, especially if you're doing so facing uphill. Then there are ridges. Ridges generally are fairly steep on their sides, but often offer a landing surface on the spine of the ridge. Valleys are the same idea, except inverted. Here's a Takasani ridge. While the sides are too steep for these super stallions to land on, the top of the ridge is more than roomy enough for them. Finally, we have mountains. Mountains have steep slopes that require hover or pinnacle insertions, but they may also have patches of level ground, ridges, or roads that give additional opportunities for landing. Here we have the extreme slope of a steep Takasani mountainside, requiring a hovering insert by little birds, whose main rotors are small enough to make this doable. It's also worth noting how water plays into this. No matter what the terrain is around it, water's level surface means that if you can't get a helicopter to land on ground near you, having it hover over nearby water allows you to swim to it and board it that way. Pilots are generally going to be responsible for obstacle recognition and avoidance, but when possible, it helps to give them a heads up as to what to expect. While obvious things like tree lines and similar stand out on the map, there are more subtle aspects that you should recognize and point out. The three primary types of obstacles you're looking for are ones that are stubby and will cause a hull strike, such as small boulders, rocks, fallen trees, stumps, short walls, fences, and similar. Ones that are tall and can cause rotor strikes, like light or telephone poles, towers, or antennas, trees, tall walls, barriers, and wires. And finally, you want to note any vehicle wrecks that might be in the area. If you're in a combat situation, you'll find a few additional considerations you'll need to make. First is masking from the enemy. Even the speediest loading of a helo takes time, and if the enemy is able to fire at the helo during this process, chaos can ensue. Masking is the act of putting things between the LZ and the expected or known direction of enemy forces. In increasing order of protection, first there's foliage, such as trees and bushes, then solid walls or buildings, and finally terrain. Trees, bushes, walls, and buildings can all be destroyed with enough ordnance, but nothing's going to get through terrain. Putting a ridgeline between your LZ and the enemy is a great way to give the helicopters a high level of protection. Whatever masking is used, an LZ in a hot environment needs defending while the aircraft are arriving, loading, and particularly if multiple lifts are going to be required. One of the benefits of doing extractions from compounds is that the walls around them are capable of providing significant masking so long as the enemy is at roughly the same level. Let's look at a few examples of common LZ types and what to consider for them. The most common LZ is in a clearing on level ground, in which you're looking for trees as the main obstacle. Often this is near a tree line when operating in wooded terrain. And note that in an urban area, soccer fields, which are typically roughly 100 meters long and 70 meters wide, can serve as great level LZs. Roads are almost always suitable for landing small helicopters, and depending on their size and nearby obstacles, are often able to handle medium ones as well. The typical hazards for a road are along it in the form of light and telephone poles, wires, and trees. The road itself, barring vehicle wrecks, is almost always going to be clear of obstacles. Sometimes you'll be in an area with parking lots, which are the same idea but larger, and which tend to have light poles scattered throughout them. Piers, again, are a similar idea with similar hazards. Then we have compounds and courtyards. A compound with walls tends to have space between buildings, alleys, or courtyards that can fit helicopters. Industrial compounds will tend to have very tall light poles throughout, and may also have machinery, construction materials, and Connex containers. Civilian compounds can be as small as a walled-in area around a single building, and as far as a helicopter is concerned, if it fits, it sits. Rooftops can be viable LZs in many situations, provided you can get to the roof and it's capable of either having a helicopter land on it, or hover above or beside it. HVAC vents and antennas are the most typical obstacles here. Helicopters are a bit more robust in Arma 3 than in prior games, but they're still not capable of taking much damage before becoming inoperable. From the perspective of a pilot, threats are primarily in the form of a few specific things. Anything with an autocannon, and particularly anti-aircraft vehicles like Shilkas, will down helicopters in a well-placed burst. Anything with a cannon, like a tank, will one-shot a helo with ease. And this also includes SPGs, which can be mounted on technicals and other light vehicles. Anything with a heavy machine gun or a grenade machine gun will shred passengers and the crew. All sorts of vehicles carry these. Anything with guided missiles, whether those are anti-air or anti-tank, are extremely dangerous due to the difficulty of avoiding them and how lethal their effects are. And lastly, the kind of obvious one, we have infantry with RPGs. They're hard to spot, difficult to dodge, and they're highly effective against helos. So as far as vehicles go, pretty much everything is a threat in some way to a helicopter. Being able to communicate the type of vehicle is important towards the risk management the pilots will do as they try to get to you. Infantry are an ever-present threat, but they tend to have trouble effectively engaging aircraft unless they have RPGs or similar. You don't want to have infantry able to shoot into the LZ in general, and you definitely don't want them to be able to fire down into the LZ. RPG gunners firing from longer range can still be very dangerous, so whenever possible, find locations that mask the LZ from those threats. There are 4 basic temperatures an LZ can be at: cold, typical, hot, and overrun. In a cold LZ, not only is there no fire currently, no attacks are ongoing or even expected. This is the kind of situation you might expect after securing an objective fully, where the enemy is either unable or hasn't had time to counterattack, or as an initial insertion into an area. Here we have a squad being picked up to be redeployed elsewhere on the battlefield, after clearing their objective. A typical LZ is typical. There are enemy in the area, it's generally infantry and light vehicles, and the aircraft should expect to receive small arms fire at some point during the approach. There are no obvious direct threats to the LZ, and the enemy is being held at bay. When not explicitly stated otherwise, this is the presumed status of an LZ. In this example, 2 little birds are able to lift a squad out of an area, while another element draws the enemy's attention at a nearby building. Hot LZs are LZs in which the enemy is within close range of the LZ and are able to potentially put effective anti-vehicle fires at it or on the approach to it. Hot LZs can occur when friendly units are having trouble defending the LZ and are taking casualties, further reducing their defensive capabilities, but often the situation is generally under control, just very active. In this example, the Black Hawk is using a village to mask the enemy, which helps to minimize its risk. An overrun LZ is a situation where the enemy has made it the perimeter of the LZ, or they're directly bordering it, and there's no longer a clear distinction between friendly and enemy locations. These are extremely dicey to land in, and the solution is often to have the survivors break out of the LZ and establish a hasty new one somewhere safer. In this example, friendly forces were in disarray and were unable to control the LZ, forcing a desperate extract attempt. It got some people out, but not everyone. Remember that while you can assess the LZ itself, it may be harder to assess any threats the helos might face on their approach. Just make sure you let them know what you know. Once you've figured out where you'll have your LZ and have assessed the situation as best as possible, it's time to call it in. Communication takes two primary forms in this, verbal and map. You should do the map markings before you give the call, so that others can follow along with the map as you describe the situation to them. Not all of this needs to be done every time, but this is what an ideal markup looks like. First, you place an LZ mark like this, named in some memorable way. This should represent the center of the LZ area, but it doesn't necessarily correlate exactly to where the helos will put down. It's just a guideline for them. If possible, you can use the map drawing tools to outline the area that you consider to be a viable LZ. This helps to give pilots an idea of how much room there is to maneuver, and it can be useful if the map doesn't exactly correlate to what it looks like on the ground. If there are poles or wires near the LZ, putting marks on them can help a lot. Don't go overboard, but especially for wires, you'll want to indicate them. And if a specific ingress direction is being requested due to dangers elsewhere, make a simple arrow showing the way you want the helos to come in. Once you have the marking done, it's time to make the request. You need to be concise but clear during that. The elements you'll communicate include the location of the LZ and the name of the mark, the LZ temperature and disposition of enemy, the directions of contact and any vehicle threats, any obstacles like wires, poles, and so forth. If you're able to mark the LZ during the final approach, and if so, how. The pilot may also ask this of you if you don't provide it in your call. A standard call with all of the elements in place would be something like this. Requesting pickup at LZ Pickups Up, 2-lane dirt road with poles on each side, and 2 minarets nearby. The LZ will be hot, the enemy are primarily on the north side. There aren't any vehicles currently active, but we've seen BRDMs and technicals from the north and the southwest. Suggested ingress is from the west, and I can pop smoke on call. To which the aircraft would reply with a readback, such as, air copies, LZ Pickups Up, road with poles on it, minarets near it, hot LZ, enemy to the north and possibly southwest, no current vehicles, ingress from the west. I'll request smoke when 60 seconds out. Now bear in mind that you only need to say what's actually relevant. It's rare to have an LZ request go that long, but if the situation dictates, it's better to give that info if you can. Signals are tools you can use to indicate where you are to aircraft or where you want them to arrive. For the purposes of this guide, we'll cover the most common ones: smoke, infrared lasers, flashlights. The benefit of all these signals is that they provide clarity between the ground and air elements. A signal placed in an LZ allows a pilot to spend more time on the nuances of the approach and less time trying to figure out where they're supposed to go. The more urgent a scenario, the more important this clarity becomes. When using smoke to mark an LZ, pick something that has high contrast against the terrain. Red and blue tend to be the best in general, with green being acceptable for urban areas, and white being acceptable for wooded or grassy areas. You can almost always put smoke directly on the LZ, since the rotor wash of a helicopter will blow it away once they arrive. Flashlights and IR lasers are used similarly at night. You want to do something that's visible and clear from the air. For flashlights, moving them in a particular pattern, or blinking them at the aircraft, if they're far away, can draw attention to that position. 2 flashlights being used to form a V on the ground can also be clear as well. For IR lasers, the best way to use them is to do a lasso. This involves pointing the laser in the air and moving it in circles. A pilot will easily see this and can quickly follow it to the source, and thus the LZ. With all of that being said, there's one more kind of LZ that can occur, which is a hasty pickup. Hasty pickups are done when the pilots are in a position to land quickly, and the window for successfully extracting a given element or person is rapidly closing. When this is the case, the pilot might tell you that they have you in sight and give you some basic directions on what to do. Often this is as simple as moving into a clearing in a specific direction, or going behind a nearby structure. Whatever they're asking, try to accomplish it expeditiously, and also communicate anything you feel is important for them to know. Hasty pickups can be used to get survivors out of an area, or to rapidly pull an element out that's about to be hit by an overwhelming enemy force. They can even be used in cold situations in which it's easier for an air element to land near the friendly force at some obvious LZ than it is to try to coordinate something more specific or elaborate. So that's much of what you want to consider when choosing and communicating LZ selections. I've already done a video on infantry LZ procedures, which you can find in the description of this, which covers what occurs when the considering and communicating ends. Additionally, TTP3 contains a good amount of reading on these topics, and you can find a link to some relevant sections in the description as well. This is dslyecxi, and until next time, take care.